Well, you may have heard me quote this advertisement in the past. It's one of the quotes that I love kind of most of all. It was an advertisement that ran for an expedition to the Arctic Circle in 1907. It was posted by a man named Ernest Shackleton, and it's become quite the famous ad. This is what the ad said. It was posted in a paper. It read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return, doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." I love how it says in case of success. Not like, we're going to get back, but, it's kind of iffy. Oddly enough, the account of Shackleton's expedition, which everybody did kind of get back, but it was a trip which was riddled with problems. But it records that people flocked to this ad. They were lining up to get onto this journey. But it's not a very positive job description, is it? It doesn't really inspire confidence in what you're getting yourself into. In our reading today, Paul has this lovely line in our second reading from 2 Timothy that says, everybody who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. Not a glowing job description. I failed to mention that to Tyler when he was talking about baptism. Paul's writing to Timothy. He's encouraging him in his life and ministry. He's trying to give him confidence and strength. But he does that without holding anything back. He makes it clear that faith in Jesus is meted out in the context of not easy religious acceptance. In fact, there's going to be difficulty. There's going to be terrible times. It'll be one of persecution and it'll be one of hurt. But he calls Timothy, and I think we all are called, to remain faithful, because that faithfulness through the thick of it all will mean our salvation. So I invite you to pick up your pew Bibles and turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. We've been going through 2 Timothy in the last couple weeks, and we have 2 more weeks to go where we're going to go through the rest of 2 Timothy. One of the things that the community of faith in Paul's day and Timothy's day that they had to deal with were false teachers. People who became a part of the Christian community for selfish reasons. People who led people away, led them astray from faith in Jesus. We heard a bit about that before. People who said that the final resurrection of our hearts and souls has already taken place. So, what we do physically, it doesn't matter. So you can just do whatever you want. In chapter 3, Paul continues talking about these types of people. And I have to say, Colin read that beautifully. Like, that was the best, that list, 4-chapter list of, people who will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, abusive, dishonest. Like, that was just perfect, because that's what it is. Paul is talking about all these types of people who place other things instead of God. He says there will be terrible times ahead in the last days. Now, when Paul mentions the last days, he isn't talking about the distant future. It's not end of the world stuff. It's not talking about Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil. Paul's thinking about today. He's thinking about today in his context, and when we read this, there will be terrible days. There will be terrible times in the last days. We read in 2014. The church has always seen the time after the resurrection of Jesus as the last days, as the end times, as the days when the church is called to do its work. And again, Paul's quite blunt. It's not going to be the easiest of times. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive. The list goes on and on. It goes on for 4 verses. But here's the main point. Love of God will be usurped by love of self. Paul actually says this in verse 4. They will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. That's the main issue. The main issue is love for God and where it stands in our lives. I have to share something. When I was talking with Tyler about baptism, if you're on Facebook, you may have seen this because I posted this conversation with Tyler. I asked Tyler, so Tyler, what do you think baptism is all about? And his response was priceless. Well, he said, he actually said that. Well, he said, like he's educating me. Well, he said, I think it's about saying that I will love Jesus and let Jesus love me. Class dismissed. Very good. Nothing more needed to be said. Like that's pretty much spot on. Sums up the faith quite well, I think. And it sums up what Paul's talking about. What takes precedence in the world? What takes precedence in our world? Spiritual pursuits? Our spiritual lives? Our connection with God in Jesus? Or more temporal, pleasure, money-filled ones? Right? And I think we can see the big picture stuff of this. You know, our world is always getting increasingly individualistic. People are proud and boastful and arrogant. Like, watch award shows, right? Like, it's all about themselves. The interesting thing about this reading is that Paul is talking not about people out there. He's talking about people in the church. People, he says, who have the form of godliness, but deny its power. In the Greco-Roman world at this point, piety was measured by outward appearance. So if you were seen to be part of a religious service of any kind, you were seen as pious. In addition to this, the more financially generous you were, the more pious you seemed to be. So people could belong to a community of faith merely out of self-interest. For business contracts, to bolster their ego, to be seen by other people. It was all about loving themselves and showing themselves as better than their competitors or other people. Right? In the Gospels, Jesus talks about this too. The Pharisees who love to be standing in the marketplace to be seen by others. Because it's the same thing. The focus is on themselves. And Paul says it's a form of godliness. It looks right. It sounds right. It does all the right stuff, but it has no power in it. It has no power because it lacks connection with Jesus. It lacks the foundational love of God that is to exist in Christian life and in Christian ministry. It's easy sometimes to focus on forms of godliness, to make sure that all the exterior things are lining up. And to be sure, some of this comes out of a place of love and care. We want to make sure that we're worshiping God in the best way possible. We want to make sure that our spiritual eyes and religious T's are all in accordance with what it should be. But if the focus is on the externals instead of who we are worshiping, then there's a problem. Now, church history has always had an issue with this. It's filled with this kind of dynamic from Reformation to revivals. Throughout history, the power of the church lies not in its ornateness or its structure, but its connection with God. In the Reformation, when they tore down kind of relics and smashed stained glass windows, it wasn't because those things were evil, but because those things became more about praising the artist. It was more about making churches beautiful rather than inspiring people to worship Jesus. And that can happen in our Christian life as well. And a lot of conversations that are happening in church worlds. Sometimes we feel that there is this need that, churches need to be flashy, right? There's all these conversations happening. There's all the reports about, how the numbers are declining. And so people say, in order for the church to move ahead, church should be done in a pub, they say. No longer in a church building because that's kind of passé, but we need to be in a pub. Or they say, get rid of the organ. Sorry, Doug. get rid of the organ, let's put in a drum machine and a praise band, because that's what people want, and that's going to be better worship than anything else. Or my personal favorite, do you know what's going to help churches? Screens. If we put screens up instead of using books, that's going to be the best. Yes, you can be a lover of God and do church in a pub.